So, let's talk about the word law. We hear it all the time, right? It's everywhere. In the news, in our day-to-day lives. But what does it actually mean? Really mean? It seems simple, but when you try to pin it down, it gets kind of tricky. So today, we're going to dive in and try to untangle this whole thing.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start by looking at how the word law can mean a few different things. Then we're going to zero in on the one that matters most to us, the law of the state. We'll explore why we have it, what makes a rule a real law, how it gets its power, and finally, the big one, how it's different from all the other social rules we live by.
Okay, Section 1. Let's tackle this head on. That word, law. It's a bit of a chameleon. It doesn't just mean one thing.
So think about it. On one hand, you've got the laws of science, right? Like F equals M times A. These are universal truths. They're not up for debate, they just are. They describe how the physical world works. But then you've got moral laws. Things like you shouldn't lie. These aren't about physics, they're about how we as people should behave based on our sense of right and wrong. So one is about what is, and the other is about what ought to be.
Now, both of those are fascinating, but for our purposes today, we're going to put them on the shelf. We are laser focused on one thing, the law of the state. And what's that? It's the set of rules that a government or state actually creates and, this is the key part, enforces.
All right, Section 2. So if we're focusing on the law of the state, what is it exactly? Well, to get a really solid handle on it, it's helpful to see how some of the great legal minds have tried to define it. They all have slightly different angles, but they lead us to the same place.
Okay, first up, Woodrow Wilson. He points out something really important. A law isn't just some random idea floating around. It's an established thought that has gotten distinct and formal recognition. And here's the kicker. It's backed by the authority and power of the government, so it's an official idea with muscle behind it.
When you've got Holland, he adds another layer. He says a law is a general rule about our external human action. So not what we're thinking, but what we're doing. And who enforces it? A sovereign political authority, the ultimate power in the land. And finally, Solomon gives us the why of it all. He says the law is this body of principles that the state uses for what purpose? For the administration of justice. It's not just rules for the sake of rules. It's about achieving justice.
So let's put all those pieces together. Wilson's government power, Holland's enforcement, Salmon's justice. What do we get? We get a really solid working definition. The law of the state is a set of rules and regulations that lays out consequences, or what we call sanctions, and is enforced by the authority of the state. You could say it's a rule with teeth, and the state is the one that does the biting.
Okay, great. Section 3. We know what it is, but so what? Why do we even have laws? What's the point? It's definitely not just a big book of things you're not allowed to do. Law actually plays some incredibly important roles in making society work.
For starters, it's the ultimate rule book for human behavior. The obvious example is punishing serious crimes like murder, but it goes way beyond that. It guides our social activities. Think about marriage laws, for instance. It creates a stable and predictable environment for businesses to operate and for our political system to function. It's really the foundation of a stable society.
And that's not all. The law is also our shield. It's what protects our fundamental rights and freedoms. It's what keeps the peace and provides security. And maybe one of its trickiest jobs is acting like a referee. Balancing all the different conflicting interests we all have. Without it, things would just be, a chaotic free-for-all.
All right, next section. So we know what law is and what it's for. But here's the thing. Not just any old rule gets to be called a law. To be a true, formal law of the state, a rule has to have some very specific characteristics. It's kind of like a recipe. You need all the right ingredients.
So let's run through the checklist. First, a law has to be based on the community's values. It can't just come out of nowhere. Second, it has to be practical, something you can actually apply in the real world. Third, it can't be stuck in the past. It's got to be dynamic, able to change as society changes. Fourth, and this is a big one, it has to be general. It should apply to everybody in pretty much all situations. And the fifth, the absolute deal breaker, it must be backed by state-enforced sanctions. If a rule fails any of these tests, you can't really call it a law.
Okay, Section 5.
Let's dig into that last point, because it's arguably the most important one: the enforcement. That's where the law gets its power, its teeth. So, where does that power come from? And what do these sanctions or penalties actually look like when you break a law? Well, first, it's important to know that not all laws are created equal. There's a hierarchy, like a pyramid. At the very top, you have the supreme laws of the land. For many, that's a constitution. In other societies, it might be Sharia or other foundational religious texts. Below that, you get the laws passed by a legislature. And below that, you have rules and decrees made by executive bodies. The key rule here: a law lower on the pyramid can never ever contradict a law that's above it.
So, what happens when you break one of these rules? The consequences, or sanctions, usually fall into one of three buckets. You can see here we've got criminal sanctions, that's about punishment. Then there are civil sanctions, which are more about finding a remedy, like making someone pay for damages they caused. And finally, you have administrative sanctions, which often apply in a professional context, like a government worker getting disciplined.
Now, if we zoom in on just the criminal sanctions, there's another clear hierarchy, this one based on how severe the punishment is. And at the very, very top, the most severe sanction of all in the systems that have it is the deprivation of life.
One step down from that is taking away someone's liberty. In other words, imprisonment, locking someone up and taking away their freedom. And then a very common sanction you see is the monetary fine, a financial penalty. So you can see it's a ladder of consequences designed to match the severity of the punishment to the severity of the crime.
Okay, last section. This brings us to a really, really important question. We all follow tons of rules every day that aren't laws, right? So what is the actual bright line difference between a formal law and, say, just a social rule or an expectation?
Let's make this super clear with an example, okay? A social rule. In many cultures, you're expected to greet an elder respectfully. What happens if you don't? Well, you might get a dirty look, people might gossip. The consequence is social blame. Now, compare that to a legal rule, breaking a signed contract. What happens then? It's not just disapproval. A court can actually force you to pay damages. That is the difference right there.
And that really is the main takeaway of this whole explainer. The line in the sand between a social rule and a legal rule is the nature of the consequence. If you break a social rule, you get social blame. But if you break a law, you face a legal sanction, a penalty that is backed up and enforced by the power of the state. That's it. That's the core difference.
So that leaves us with one final, pretty heavy question to think about. If we agree that law is a set of rules enforced by the power of the state, what happens when the people, the very people being governed, start to question whether that state power is legitimate? What happens when the foundation itself starts to crack? That's definitely something to think about.